All right. Well, thanks, and I think that they make the kids talk to you guys after lunch to keep everybody excited. And so you get Jordan and I this afternoon, and it's our pleasure to represent the Feed Safety Research Team. This team is really quite a unique thing to K-State, and we appreciate our administrators and we appreciate you and as industry really supporting our efforts. That's something very uniquely K-State, combining our knowledge and capabilities on the feed manufacturing side with those in diagnostic medicine, pathobiology from the vet school, and then of course applied swine nutrition. And so we're fortunate to be able to be part of this team, and of course top of mind for all of us in the room, especially as we think about feed safety, is African swine fever virus. I first want to celebrate because it's November of 2021 and we still are negative in the United States and collectively in North America from this devastating disease. Unfortunately, it keeps coming closer and closer and closer, and is uncomfortably close now with recent reports in July and then ultimately in September from the island of Hispaniola. And what's probably most scary about that is, of course, its proximity, but also the fact that the virus was probably there for months before we recognized what it was and how close it actually was. And so it does not spell nicely if this disease were to be transmitted into a new country of origin, and it needs to be top of mind for all of us as we're checking pigs, recognizing signs of foreign animal disease, because this is overwhelmingly our biggest threat as we stand here today. That said, we are doing a lot of things right, and so there's a lot of efforts being made to continue to prevent ASF entry. Some of those from the USDA side. Of course, we have stop order movements of live animals, of pork products, of germplasm, and that continues to be an important area of emphasis. One of the issues, though, with that is that historically it's been underfunded. And so we're celebrating again today that we had a huge investment from USDA recently on investing in prevention efforts for ASF. As this continues to move closer to our borders and preventing it continues to get harder and harder, we finally have some investment into APHIS field staff for surveillance and detection capabilities, into our Nuln laboratories, and ultimately into something we hope we never have to use: the stockpile of supplies, disposal supplies, and depopulation supplies that we hope to never have to break into. But if we do have to utilize them, having access to those quickly, recognizing the signs of disease, and stamping out that disease before it spreads is going to be paramount to continue to have survival within our U.S. pork industry. In the K-State side, a lot of what we've been working on is coordination. And Jordan and I joke a little bit because he gets to talk about the science today and the data, and I get to talk about some of the policy side of things, and coordinating these efforts between our feed industry and our partners in the feed industry, as well as with our swine industry partners, and then the other livestock sectors, and making sure everybody recognizes the risk that this disease poses, and ultimately making sure that we have agreement and alignment in what are considered to be best practices and what's important for us to be excluding from the United States as we think about global trade. We know, of course, that feed is possible to transmit African swine fever virus. It's not likely to occur, but it can happen. And so while we rely on other regulatory agencies to prevent live animals from being imported, to prevent affected pork from being imported, we get to focus on feed. And that's our area to really focus on. And we've demonstrated that scientifically the virus can theoretically survive and it can cause infection. One of the big unknowns, though, is how likely is it to be contaminated in these products in the first place? If we think about a raw material or an ingredient in country X or region Y, where there is circulating or endemic ASF, how likely is it that those ingredients imported from those countries actually have the virus present? And that knowledge really helps implement and enforce science-based policy decisions as we move forward. But it's really the last remaining unknown. We know that the virus can survive, we know it can cause infectivity through a feed matrix. We just can't characterize right now how likely it is to be in the ingredients that we're importing each and every day from some of these countries. And so we're taking a lot of steps to do things like preventing swill and contaminated tissue or garbage from affected pork or affected pigs into plate waste that could get into animals. We know that's the most direct stream through a livestock feeding entity. What we don't know is the potential role of contaminated waterways or contamination spreading from affected wild boar or feral pigs in areas that have ASF to crops or agronomic commodities that are grown in those regions. We just don't know. And so we've been a part of a number of different groups like the European Food Safety Authority and USDA trying to characterize risk so that we can better manage that risk, and we just don't know. Some of our data from Vietnam that Jordan will present is some of the most conclusive data we have, but what we at least believe is that we can break these categories of ingredients into different types of risk. Those that are whole grains and seeds and could actually come into direct contact with feral pigs or wild boar from regions with circulating disease, they're most likely the ones that could get infected in the first place, have some type of contamination event. When we think about processed grains and seeds from the same region, it's less likely that they're going to be contaminated at their point of arrival in the US. If you think about something like whole soy, how could a whole soybean get contaminated with ASF? We can understand that in field conditions, but then if we look at something like soybean meal, after it's been through a hexane extraction process, after it's been through through toasting and desolventizing, at least some of those processes should have reduced the probability or prevalence of that virus. But again, we don't know, and so we have that listed as more of a moderate risk category because we can't control post-processing cross-contamination. But then likewise we would have categories of ingredients that we would consider to be lower risk. Things that are manufactured, fermented, amino acids, concentrated drug sources, and vitamins. Yes, they might originate or be produced in these countries, but their risk is very different than something that was actually grown in the fields that come into direct contact with feral pigs in that region. And so helping the industry understand, and actually helping regulators understand how all ingredients are not created equal, and how certainly survivability and infectivity differs by ingredient category. We also have differences based on the likelihood of those products to have contamination in the first place. And ultimately, that's what's influencing our policy right now. And the best thing that we can do is just exclude some of these things altogether. If we want to look at the best option is to recognize there are some high-risk ingredients, let's just exclude them. And we look to some of our trade partners and some of the leaders in the trade side from a food safety side of things like Australia and Canada who have implemented some of these policies. We have a lot of people in our swine industry that look at that and say, why can't we do that? Let's do some of those activities. Well, realistically, every one of us in the room should be doing that right now in our own business. And then from a regulatory perspective, we've been having those conversations. How could we exclude high-risk ingredients altogether? Unfortunately, it's pretty complicated because I start asking questions like, what's a high-risk ingredient? And from what country? And how did it get here? And those questions, based on how we trade and how the flow of grain and some of these soybeans exists in the world, gets a whole lot more complicated. That's one of the things that we've been asking our grad students to dig into. So I know Jordan will recognize them in a bit, but Olivia Harrison just finished her master's degree, is beginning her PhD in our program, and someone's leaning against the lights in the back. Sorry, guys. The lights go low. All right, and so she's been working with data from the United States International Trade Commission to better understand what are we bringing into the United States. And so this data shows, first and foremost, of course we don't import very much feed or ingredients or agricultural commodities because we're a net exporter of most of these products. What we do bring in is almost all, from a volume basis, very low risk. It's either from ASF negative countries altogether, or if it is from an ASF positive country, it's at least one of those categories, like a vitamin or an amino acid, that's unlikely to have some source of contamination. So that's really what this shows, but I'm going to actually blow up this y-axis because it's these ones that we recognize are relatively low volume, but still represent the most risk to us in terms of products that could be a source of entry of ASF into the United States. So I'm going to take this y-axis from about 8 million metric tons to about 1 million metric tons, and then you can better see that we're actually importing more in 2020 than what we ever have before. And I could take this data all the way back, but we just have it demonstrated back to 2016. And yes, again, we're optimistic that most of the stuff we have coming in is low-risk ingredients, but we have high-risk ingredients coming in from ASF-endemic regions. The most important question for me is, what are those ingredients and why are they coming in? And so that's what Olivia really dug into, because we can take that one data point and try to dig that out. That's about 350 million or 350,000 metric tons, and this is all of that. So if we look at every country in the year of 2020 that was ASF positive from which we imported an agricultural commodity, we have that data, and it's from Armenia to Vietnam. So these are all the countries along the x-axis that we imported something like a whole grain or a whole oilseed from. And then we can characterize what type of thing did we import. Was it grains? Was it whole soybeans? Was it some other type of product? You can see up there, first I want to point out China, because a lot of our kind of emphasis that I see in the media, that I hear from producers, is very much about a specific country in terms of China. We're not bringing in very much from China, guys. At least in 2020 we weren't. But we've been pulling in a lot from Germany. Now that's actually the reason that we have this big spike, because in 2019, guess what country was negative for ASF? Germany. The fact that this disease continues to spread to our trade partners continues to pose risk for us in the United States. As soon as Germany goes positive, and again, we're now looking at another farm that was reported this morning with unknown spread and entry into that region, into a region of Germany that we didn't know how it got there. But we dig into what this research is, or what these data points are. This is almost all buckwheat. Now, is buckwheat being brought in and fed to pigs? No. Right? Buckwheat's being brought in, at least from what we can tell, for the human food industry because it's gluten-free. Likewise, that's what's coming in from Romania, and when we look at the soy that's being imported, almost all of that is GMO-free. And so it's really these consumer trends that are influencing any of these commodities coming into the United States. That's good news for us as we sit here as pork producers, because we can't afford any of that, right? That's going into the human food supply chain. But we know the fact that it comes into the industry or comes into the country poses some level of risk. And then we know that there's co-products and byproducts that can result from these and potentially pose risk. And so again, it's something important for us to remember. And again, as we start looking at soy, and soy specifically, some of Allison Bloom's data from our team has looked at those soy-based products and what those trends have done over time. And if we look at where we've been bringing in soy from countries that are positive for any foreign animal disease, we see some consumer pressure and some of our pork industry pressure and feed industry pressure moving away from some countries, but it's increasing in others. And that's even more so when we pull this to just the ASF data. You can see so much volume is coming in from India. India doesn't grow that much soy. They don't export that much soy. But they do when you look at trade data and numbers. Because if I were to enact a regulatory policy to exclude a high-risk ingredient like whole soy from a country that was ASF positive, like India is, it could capture this. Here's the problem. Turkey's not on this chart at all. The fact that it's coming from India is really just a byproduct of the fact that India has a lot of ports. And so we have a lot of movement from regions in the area through rail to the ports in India that then get sent on a ship into the United States and ultimately end up, hopefully someday, they end up here on our shores in the United States. And so where a product is shipped from is not necessarily where that product is grown. And it's actually impossible for us right now to identify where that product was grown. We can only identify where it was shipped, where it originated, the port of origin. And likewise, once it comes into the United States, as we stand today, we can't identify if that comes in for the human food industry, for the livestock industry, or specifically for pork producers. And so that makes this a very complicated question. And so while we, as a swine industry and collectively as a feed industry, need to continue to do our part to exclude high-risk ingredients, it also puts some additional burden and emphasis on the other two hurdles. Doing everything we can to minimize cross-contamination risk and to mitigate with things that we know that work scientifically. And so for those, you get Jordan.